Hi, I'm Jakub Grygiel. I'm a professor at Catholic University of America in the Department of Politics. And I've taught for the Hertog program for the last on and off, I guess, almost a decade. The main difference is, well, twofold. One is the students. There's a great self-selection, and the students are superb. And the second one is it is a compressed teaching schedule. Obviously, it's a week long, at least for me or for each individual professor, and it's a very intense week, several days of mornings or afternoons debating a particular question, a particular book. That doesn't happen that often in a regular academic setting where you meet once a week or twice a week over the course of a semester. So this is the intensity of it is stimulating, I think, both for the students as well as for the faculty. Be ready to read a lot and enjoy it. This is something that is perhaps antiquated in modern academia or modern social settings, but I think is absolutely necessary, both for the Hertog program, but above all for your life. Reading a book in particular, I think, is a rare occasion to get into the mind of a writer, whether it's literature or history or anything else, and develop very slowly the ability to understand the argument that the writer is making, and therefore develop the ability to actually make your own arguments. Arguments are not tweets. They're not 100 words or whatever the characters, whatever the tweet may be. They can be simple thoughts, but they're products of a lengthy deliberation, which often the book is exactly that, the lengthy deliberation. Now, the final product, the final thought, the final idea may be very simple and very easy to summarize in some cases. But the process of getting there to that simplicity of thought requires, I think, a lot of work. And reading those books, I think, prepares the students, the reader, for that work. Thucydides himself says at the beginning of his book that his book is a possession forever. It may not be a very humble statement on his part, but it's true. There's something in the book that is really recurrent in history and perhaps eternal. And I think in that sense, that book is always present and always relevant. And maybe that's it's a basic definition of what a classic text may be. A classic text is a text that the reader will find always fresh, with questions that are timeless, despite the different conditions, despite the different technologies, despite the different cultural traits. Despite being ancient Greek history, it still presents the reader with questions that are quite recurrent. To give you an example, one of the key questions that arises in the book early on is, how can Athens, which is a maritime power, a sea power, how can Athens compete and perhaps defeat its enemy, Sparta, a land power? That's a recurring question in history. How can sea powers use their advantages that they have to compete with land powers? They can't defeat them on land because they don't have the army, the interest, the capability to compete there. But they have other advantages which it's very hard for them to lose those advantages, given that the enemy is a land power. And that's the question that is recurrent, I think, obviously in the book, Thucydides, but also in history. How can we, for instance, the US, a maritime empire, how can we compete with large Eurasian land powers, whether it's Russia, whether it's Iran, and certainly China in the future? So that's one of the many reasons, I think, why Thucydides is very interesting for anybody interested in politics. I would add one more thing, is that one of the recurring questions that Thucydides raises in the book relates to the question of what a good leader is. What does it mean to be a good leader? Both a military commander, but more importantly, a political leader, which for him are not necessarily two separate things. Does it mean that he has to be virtuous, capable of self-restraint, or a good leader is somebody who is flamboyant and interested in personal glory, and nonetheless quite effective on the battlefield and in leading the state to certain great strategic achievements. And it's a question that he has an answer here and there, but it presents the reader with actually constant questions and therefore constant deliberation, debates on that issue of what a good leader is. The beauty of Thucydides in the book is that he puts the reader in front of key debates during the Peloponnesian War. These debates are about how and whether to punish a rebellious city, how to go to war, whether to go to war, when and how and what is needed for a large expedition to a distant island, Sicily. And these debates place the reader in front of very difficult decisions. Thucydides is often very neutral or objective, and he allows the reader, or forces the reader, to make his or her own mind in that moment in time, in that place, under those circumstances. So the class, especially in the Hertog program, will examine those decision points, and we will debate which decision should the Athenians, the Spartans, take in a given moment. And these are not easy decisions. They require prudence, but above all, they require a certain ability to think through the unthinkable, things that we don't have a full knowledge of, and that will lead to unknown outcomes. It's the same for the Athenians and the Spartans. They had no perfect knowledge. They don't know where the decision is going to lead, and nonetheless, they had to make a decision. So I always tell the students, don't be afraid to make a decision. You have no full knowledge. The Athenians didn't have full knowledge. And in your own life, especially when you get involved in politics and foreign policy, you will never have full knowledge, no matter how much intelligence you get, no matter how much data you can possibly process, whether you as an individual or the computer that you have in front of you. That's not perfect knowledge. That's not complete knowledge. And the decision will require a certain level of courage or prudence. And you develop that by exactly doing what Thucydides asks you to do. Get into the moment and think through the various potential outcomes and make a decision. Throw yourself into the decision. One of the key questions that Thucydides also raises is, how does war change the culture and the mindset or the nature, actually, of the city, the polity, the state, the nation, the community? War, he says, is a violent teacher that teaches certain things to people which are not necessarily always good. And one of the underlying stories in the whole Peloponnesian War, the book that he wrote, is a certain decline or decadence, or degeneration rather, of Athens. The Athens of year 10 or year 16 of the war is not the same Athens of year 1. And to a large degree, that's a direct consequence of the length of the war. War is inevitable, perhaps even necessary, but the costs of war go beyond just the material losses or the casualties. The costs war affects, in other words, how a state, a polity, a city perceives itself and what it's capable of doing. Towards the end of the war, the Athenians do things that they would never conceive doing in the first year of the war, including, for instance, not burying their dead, which is one of the key aspects or key positive virtues of a political entity, the respect for the dead. One of the most famous speeches of Western civilization and of the book is the funeral oration of Pericles after the first year of the war. It doesn't happen at year 16 of the war. The Athenians abandon their dead on the battlefield and don't bury them. that is a consequence, a direct consequence of the war. I've taught Thucydides now 20 years, multiple times. I'm not an ancient historian. I'm interested in politics, current foreign policy, grand strategy, guns and bombs in many ways. But Thucydides is always fresh because it's a way of debating current events without debating current events. And it detaches us in a healthy way, I think, from the froth and from the acrimony, in many ways, of debates that are on the front pages of the news, whether domestic or international. And I think that's a good medium of creating a debate, which is necessary in any democratic setting, by debating things that happened centuries ago. So that's always an exciting process, in other words, of seeing students discover that we're really not debating Athens or Sparta. We're debating decisions that we may be facing regarding China or Iran or Russia. We're not really debating what's happening in Washington, D.C. today. We're debating what happens in Athens, and yet the parallels are quite evident. Usually we never touch current events, but I think at a certain point for most of us in the class, it becomes evident that we're touching current events. And that's, in many ways, it's exciting and refreshing. I'm a product, in many ways, of the Cold War. I grew up in it, and I grew up also at the very end of it, and those are the formative experiences, in many ways, of my life. And to a large degree, that's why I was always interested in foreign policy and international relations. The Cold War seemed at that time as something that would never end, especially in the early 80s, something that we would live for the rest of our lives. Obviously, that was not the case. The Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War ended. But it was clear, I think, to people that grew up in the Cold War that some other tragedy or some other problem would arise, despite sort of the 1990s pretense that there was the end of history and nothing that happened in the past would happen again, or the progress of history was inevitable. And in that sense, I was always, as you can see probably from the background here, I'm interested in the classics, even though, again, I'm not a classicist or an ancient historian. The classics have that inherent ability, I think, to convey that history is, to a certain degree, tragic. Not in the sense of being constantly sad or depressing, not at all. But tragic in the sense that the solution of a problem will lead to another problem. Or another way to put it is, in politics, foreign policy, problems can never be solved. It's not like math, 2 + 2 = 4, and you're done. Politics, it's a constant management of a condition. And yes, you may want to attempt to win and mitigate the condition. You want to defeat the enemy, but the defeat of an enemy solves perhaps that particular problem, but it leads to some other problem, perhaps obviously much smaller in size and threat and in the level, for instance, of casualties that it causes. But it's a problem nonetheless. So politics is more of a management of a human condition rather than a solution of the human condition. And again, the classics, and Thucydides in particular, I think, are great authors to read to convey that idea.